Our whole generation has been told again and again and again that the planet is urbanizing. The planet is urbanizing. People are moving to cities. By 2050, half the world's population, 80% of the world's population will live in cities. Whatever those statistics continue to be and change, the story has always been about people moving to cities. But if you really look at the data, if you really unpack how urbanization is unfolding today, people aren't moving to cities today to inhabit their urban cores. They're moving to metro areas to compete for space along the sprawling edges of these larger metropolitan areas where there's some potential for affordable housing still. There's still sort of access to the American dream in this sort of context. But that kind of urbanization, that sort of process of accelerated urbanization along these edges creates these increasingly massive zones of conflict between the built environment and landscape systems, right? So maybe this is bringing us back to this question of landscape urbanism and what it means in answer to your question, right? Like if suburban and exurban development forms really haven't changed much since the 1960s and arguably even since the 1930s. But in a climate changed world that's also undergoing a massive biodiversity crisis, right? These sort of legacy land use configurations and paradigms are just exacerbating these kinds of pressures in a really intense way. So I think the kinds of natural disasters that we're seeing today are largely the result of the kind of urbanization, the story of 21st century urbanization that, in my opinion, has been kind of an unsung version of this story, but is increasingly important for us to understand as landscape urbanists in particular.
And your contention is that basically that urbanization is not occurring in the traditional kind of what we think of as the city. It's happening on the outskirts, closer and closer to these landscapes.
Exactly. Those are putting a much bigger percentage of the population at arm's reach, or putting them directly in the line of fire, so to speak, when it comes to exposure to natural disasters. There's just a much higher percentage of the total population that is experiencing that exposure.
For those non-urbanists like me, can you explain like what is the edge and what makes going to the edge instead of the center expose kind of new residents to these natural disasters more than traditionally?
I mean, I think when we look at traditional forms of urban growth, in the 19th century, we had kind of hub and spoke model cities, right? So we had an urban core that was often co-located around a port or some other sort of center of commerce or commercial exchange. And over time, you would see these sort of spokes of transportation radiating out from that urban center to allow for residential land uses or new forms of occupation or industrialization. What we see today is essentially a polycentric urban morphology. So if you look at metro areas today, it's not so much that we have New York City and Boston and Philadelphia, it's that we have the whole sort of Boston to Washington corridor as one large metropolitan continuum.
Oswash region.
The Boswash region, right? Or you look at the Texas Triangle, or you look at the Sun Belt, or you look at the LA metro area, which is just this incredible kind of composite of different, smaller scaled cities and communities. Because we don't have that sort of centrality to our cities anymore, if you just sort of think about it almost from a physical standpoint, there's much more surface area now at the edges of cities. It's also because of challenges associated with affordable housing and development and regulation. These represent some of the only viable places for new development to occur. And so a lot of the new development, the lion's share of new development in metropolitan areas is further out from these sort of traditional urban cores.
So you're basically saying that the modern city is not about intense density in one place. It's about spreading far and wide.
Yeah, and it's about polycentricism. So it's about multiple smaller centers as opposed to one massive center of gravity and a series of bedroom communities outside of that. We now have multiple centers where we can live and work and go to school, and that's really changed the way that urban systems inscribe themselves into the surrounding landscape. And I think that has also, to come back to this question of natural disaster, particularly around wildfire, put millions and millions more into the sort of line of fire or directly into these landscapes that are quite vulnerable or fire prone to begin with.
Let's focus on wildfire now. It's getting hot. We're recording this at the end of July and it's getting drier. Can you explain for us what a wildfire is? I think we all have an image of it, but how does it start? How does it occur? What should we know about wildfires before we unpack sort of their implications?
A wildfire is also kind of a misnomer. Most wildfires are started by people. So, that's another sort of important little piece of information, I think, to sort of frame this conversation. Wildfire, has historically been fire that's either started by humans, whether that be, a cigarette butt in the woods or, a spark from the underside of a truck on the freeway. For millions and millions of years, most of the Earth's terrestrial ecosystems have co-evolved with regular periodic fires as a natural part of these ecosystems. And those are typically fires that are started by lightning strikes. Most terrestrial forest and shrubland and grassland ecosystems are all deeply connected to these fire cycles, depending on the kind of fuel types and the sorts of, fire-prone ecosystems that you're looking at. You'll have different return intervals, different kinds of fire cycles. Wildfire is sort of, as it's understood by the firefighting community, is sort of fire that's consuming wildland fuels as opposed to urban fuels. So trees and grass and shrubs as opposed to houses and cars and propane tanks. I think one of the things that's important in terms of the kinds of wildfires that we're seeing today is in part because of this imbrication of fire-prone ecosystems by urban development. We're seeing more and more fires that are starting in these wildland fuels and then becoming urban conflagrations once they jump into neighborhoods and communities.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
모스트 포던 팟캐스트